I think this is the perfect timing for me then to introduce our guest of honor, Professor Stanley Whittingham. As many of you know that Professor Whittingham's groundbreaking work on intercalation chemistry is what enabled the revolution in battery technology and electric vehicle technology. Dr. Whittingham is currently the University Distinguished Professor in SUNY Binghamton. And Professor Whittingham received the 2019 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. So we are very fortunate today to have Professor Whittingham to share with us the past, the present, and the future of lithium-ion batteries. Professor Whittingham, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me and can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So many thanks for the invitation to speak this morning in Korea. And what I want to do is give you a little bit of an overview, show you where we've come from, where we are now, and maybe where we expect to go. But let me just first of all thank the US Department of Energy, who have supported my research for around 30 years now. So this is where we were in the mid-1970s. We made little batteries to give away. These are basically coin cells. And we also made batteries about 6 inches by 4 inches by an inch thick, which were used at the EV show in Chicago. So for those who are not aware, there was a lot of interest in electric vehicles back in the 1970s, partly provoked by some gasoline shortages. And I just remind you to look at this. We used single crystals, TiS2 at that time. I'll come back to that shortly. So that's where we started out 45 years ago. This is where we are today. So you can buy small cars like this one we rented in Bermuda a couple of years ago, all the way to large 16-wheeler trucks. And this is lithium-ion batteries. And to the right is a garbage truck. The garbage truck is almost ideal use for electric vehicles. Stop, start, raise and drop. And these trucks are made by Peterbilt, and I understand are in service now. To put in perspective where we're going, Britain has outlawed the sale of internal combustion cars for individuals starting in 2030. And this just shows 2 electric vehicles that the ambassador took to Sweden, the Jaguar and the London taxi. And this, things like the London taxi, we can expect major cities, Seoul, London, Paris, New York, I would say within the next 5 to 10 years, to ban all non-electric vehicles from their downtowns, to keep them clean and quieter. As we all know, lithium batteries really came about for need in electronics. Sony was vertically integrated, wanted a battery, and they really developed the technology that originated in Europe and the US. Clearly, again, batteries are of great use for energy storage. And to show you just how far they've gone in the grid, I'll show you the situation in Texas initially. In Texas, not exactly a climate-friendly state. As of last August, September, 94% of all future planned generation was renewable, with a lot of it solar, some wind and storage to go with that, a tiny amount of gas, essentially no coal at all. To make this work, clearly you need storage, and this is a facility under construction now in Texas. It's 100 megawatts. It's believed to be a 4-hour facility, but it's not being publicized. But this is small compared with what is happening in California. So California, last December, opened up and started running a 1.2 gigawatt hour lithium-ion facility. This is at Moss Landing, about an hour and a half south of San Francisco. It's built in an old gas power plant. So ideal situation where all the grid infrastructure was already there. This is already going to be expanded to 1.6 gigawatt hours this year, and they got planning permission to go to 6 gigawatt hours. So this shows you the feasibility of even today's lithium-ion batteries of really helping renewable energy, helping stabilize the grid, and making a profit for the utilities. Let's just go back just to the beginning. I don't think I need to go through this. Back in 1972, we started off with pure lithium. Then Esso, now ExxonMobil, we switched to lithium aluminum fairly quickly because of the dendrite issue. Lithium aluminum doesn't cycle for more than maybe a dozen or so cycles effectively. So the new anode had to be found, and this is where Kira Yoshino came in with the graphitic carbons. They work beautifully since 1990 to the present day, but they take up half the volume of the cell, so they basically have to go now. So the potential to replace them by silicon, we've shown that tin compounds work very well, work in fact better than silicon, but obviously there's weight and volume issues. But the ideal endpoint is go full circle back to lithium again. On the cathode side, we started out with a layered compound, TiS2. It worked very well, and I'll show you why in a minute. John Goodenough was working on lithium cobalt oxide. Its magnetic properties, recognized the structures were the same, decided to test cobalt oxide, and this raised the voltage from about 2.5 to 4 volts. And this has been the workhorse for all electronics batteries from 1990 to the present day. Clearly, cobalt has to go, so that's why we've gone to NMCs and NCAs. And eventually, I think we'll show in a minute, mention nickel and cobalt they will have to go also. John also came up with the idea of using the olivine lithium iron phosphate, much lower cost, safer, but much lower energy density, and I'll show you a few numbers in a moment. And one way of increasing the energy density is to switch iron out for manganese, increase the voltage from 3.5 to 4 volts. That gains you a bit. But if you could really intercalate 2 lithium ions or 2 sodium ions in these phosphate lattices, you could get almost back to the energy densities of the layered oxides. I don't think I need to go through this picture for the present audience. But let's look at why TiS2 was special. It's what we call a soft lattice. So it's a covalent lattice. It's a metallic lattice, so it's essentially a metallic conductor. You don't need any carbon black in it, but the metallic conductivity shields the ions from the negative charge on the lattice, so they can move very fast. And as we showed back in the 70s, you could in fact run lithium at 10 milliamps per square centimeter at room temperature in the lithium cell. And this is the 76th cycle. Brian Steele was looking at the sodium compound, and again, you can cycle this material, but the sodium compound is disappointing in the sense there's a huge voltage change here. And it looks like today the layered oxides are much more attractive for sodium than the layered sulfides. But what this soft lattice did allow, it allows for divalent cations to be readily and reversibly intercalated. And Linda Nazar's group basically displaced the molysulfide Chevreul phase as the record holder for magnesium using titanium disulfide. This isn't, in this case, this is Spinel phase. The layered phase is very similar. And you can see this cycles very well. She has shown 40 cycles on this. But the downside of magnesium, it needs to be at 60 degrees centigrade, and the current density is much less. So the use of magnesium, sodium, and potassium help us understand ionic transport in these materials, but we shouldn't really think that magnesium is going to be a viable rechargeable battery. its voltage is just too low. You can see it's almost a volt of lithium. So where do we stand now? A lot of people say the Nobel Prize was given out, therefore this R&D on batteries should be finished. It couldn't be further from the truth. If we actually look at today's batteries, they attain less than 30% of their theoretical limits. So we've got lots of opportunity there. And the highest capacity cell I found looking in literature about a year ago was in fact an LG cell. And this one attains almost 25% of the volumetric capacity and essentially the same on the gravimetric. And this has now the highest volumetric capacity of a commercial cell. But if you look at what we theoretically should be able to get, we have plenty of opportunity for improvement. And the first step to improve is to get most of this carbon out. But even a little bit of silicon in there, it will help. We need to use cathodes with a higher lithium content. So on the layered oxides, we only use about 60% of the lithium now. We need to use more of it, or as I'll mention in a moment, we can use 2 lithium ions per redox center. The other key thing is we need higher ionic and electronic conductivities in our active materials. Unlike TiS2, most of the present day materials, including the layered oxides of semiconductors, we're talking about the phosphates, they're pretty good insulators. So if we can improve the conductivity, then we can make thicker electrodes, reduce the amount of current collector and the amount of separator. So you can see how much dead weight there is in these cells, about 3/4 of the weight. A key issue as discussed there in the previous presentation is safety. And the question is, can we improve the safety by going solid state or using single crystals? And I think we may hear more about that in the next talk. And clearly, eventually, we have to get rid of certainly the cobalt. In the next year or two, we've gone from about 1/3 cobalt to 10% in these compounds today. Like in this LG cell is 80% nickel. And eventually, I think the nickel will probably also have to go. So let's look at what the real challenges are. So we look at the layered oxides, and I'll discuss those first as they're the workhorse of the business. The real issue in the layered oxides is energy density versus safety. You want to increase the energy density, you're going to increase the nickel content, in which case the safety drops. And this is a famous plot now by the South Korean group of Young-suk Sun. And you can see if we want the highest capacity, we've got about 85% nickel. And this will release oxygen readily at 220 degrees centigrade. I should point out, this means these compounds are metastable even at room temperature. So given the opportunity, they will release oxygen there. But the thermal stability, we hope we never get to these temperatures, but the thermal stability is a direct measure of the reactivity of these materials with the electrolyte. So they give problems with capacity retention. So our challenge is really to get in this top corner. We want the greatest stability and the highest capacity we can get. So as I mentioned, the stability is really a kinetic issue. If we can somehow stabilize the lattice so the ions other than the lithium do not move much, it should be more stable. So we are presently studying the reactivity of these materials. And the Battery 500 project is in particular looking to get the energy density of these materials up from this 250 to 260 up to 500. And I'll show you the latest data in this slide. This is data collected by the Pacific Northwest National Lab Group of Jay Xiao. And she makes these cells and sends them to Idaho National Lab to be tested, so it's independent. And these are on 60% nickel. And you can see that how the things have changed over the last 3 years. In the first year, we got just 50 cycles out of this at 300 watt-hours per kilogram. A year later, we're up to about 225. And in 2019, we still have 225, but now we've gone from 300 to 350. And right now, we're somewhere at 500 cycles at 350 watt hours per kilogram. So we can do this. I should point out this is using a lithium metal anode, and the electrolyte has been switched from a carbonate to an ether-based electrolyte. The carbonates are not good for lithium deposition. And this is a typical cell. They're all about 2 ampere hours. So this is 350 watt hours per kilogram and 700 watt hours per liter. So this is where the Battery 500 project stands now. There's optimism we will get well over 400 and maybe even achieve the 500 goal. But to do that, we've got to use all this lithium in these layered oxides. So if you look at the present day cells, essentially all the NMCs lose between 10 and 15% of their capacity on the very first cycle. So we look at this, we charge this up, in this case up to about 4.4 volts, discharge it, then we never get back to our original point. And this is important capacity, because capacity at about 3.5 to 3.6 volts, where the electrolyte is extremely stable. So we need to recover that material. So we set out to understand what's going on there. And we clearly speculated that this was related to diffusion. And what we found out is that diffusion falls very fast at very high lithium contents. So up to about 70%, 75% lithium contents, about 10 to the minus 9. As soon as you go above that, it drops by 3 orders of magnitude. And this is due to the diffusion mechanism, which is a divacancy mechanism. So you need, for every ion to jump, you need 2 vacancies next to that ion. And you can look at this as if you look at a lecture hall. The lecture hall is 75% of the seats are full. Seldom are 2 of those empty seats next to each other, and invariably they're in the middle of the lecture hall. So all the people have to move. In this case, all the ions have to move. So that's a challenge here. Fast charging this material should not be an issue. You can see it's flat all the way into the last 10%. And this is same if you look at the lecture hall. When people empty it, they flow out evenly. So to prove to ourselves that diffusion was probably the rate controlling step here, we looked at raising the temperature. So this shows that same data now at 4 different charging voltages. So we charge up, in this case, to 4.2 volts, take it back to 2.8, then hold it there for a few hours, and you can see we get some of the capacity back. Clearly diffusion control. Same at 4.4 volts, comes back to about the same position. 4.6, we're getting more capacity, 4.8, even more. But now you're seeing the charge and discharge curves are separating. So using these carbonated electrolytes, in this case, we're getting side reactions occurring at these higher voltages of 4.6 and 4.8. So this is giving us problems. And you can see here, we're not even getting as much lithium back in as when we charged at lower voltage. When we increase the temperature, you can see at 4.4 volts, we get almost all of it back in. At 4.6 volts, not quite all, but this is now because these are separating. So we got more side reactions, more impurities formed on the surface. And at 4.8 volts, we're losing a lot of capacity. So using this 811, in this case, this material is, and using the carbonated electrolytes, they are not stable at 45 degrees centigrade, much above 4.4 volts. So we felt we should be able to solve this, and we lent on lithium cobalt oxide, because lithium cobalt oxide does not show first cycle loss. And what we did in this case, very similar experiments. Here's our 811. In this case, we charged to 120 milliampere hours per gram. The black is room temperature. We now held it for 100 hours and you can see we can get all the lithium back in. At 45 degrees centigrade, same thing. Before we lithium cobalt oxide is the same room temperature 45, so not an issue. You should point out lithium cobalt oxide and lithium rich cobalt oxide are two separate phases. So at this point, we've got a two-phase reaction. But we assumed if this lithium cobalt oxide can work, then we should be able to modify the structure of the 811 to make it behave like lithium cobalt oxide. So we did this by modifying the NMC by both substitution and coatings. And the material I'm reporting here, we actually used a niobium solution, lithium niobium oxide. So we started with pure NMC 811, then soaked it in a 1% lithium niobium oxide solution, or 2% or 3%. You can see it makes no difference. 1% is as good as 2 or 3%. When we do this, we're now eliminating about 40% of that first cycle loss. So it clearly works. The system isn't quite as simple as we thought, because in fact, when the niobium goes into this lattice, it in fact displaces some of the manganese. So the outer coating is in fact a mixed lithium niobium manganese phase, not just a niobium oxide phase. So we wanted to understand exactly what is happening here. So by coating it, we can reduce the first cycle loss. By substituting niobium in here, and the only difference here is coating, we fire the material at 500 centigrade. If we fire at 700, then the niobium goes totally into the lattice. And the blue curves here is 700, the red is 500, so substitution coating, and this is the virgin material, the black one. So you can see by modifying with niobium, we in fact get better capacity retention. This is for 300 cycles, and this just shows the capacity retention as a percentage. So here's the substituted highest, then the coated, and the black one. Why is that the case? Well, we looked at these materials, and this is dQ by dV plots, and you see the unsubstituted, this voltage here shifts continuously. When we substitute it, there's very much less shift. So the material is much less reactive. We feel the surface is not changing as much, and therefore this material is being stabilized against reaction with the electrolyte and maybe against oxygen loss. So we did one more set of measurements. We looked at the thermal stability of these materials, again, the same color scheme. And you can see there's not really much difference in the peak temperature here, just under 200, 204, 204. If we expand this a little bit, you can see there is a slight difference here. But the big difference here is the amount of heat evolved. So from the unsubstituted, it's 204 joules per gram. For the coated, it goes down to 175, and for the substituted, down to 162. So these materials are more thermally stable, and as I said earlier, this is probably a kinetic phenomenon. The ions can't move so rapidly. But the other key feature here, the impedance of the modified materials, it's much lower than the unmodified. So here's the black one, unmodified, surface coated, substituted. So again, we're modifying that surface so it's not so reactive. We reduced its resistance. Now, we want to push the limits of the high nickel as far as we can. Question is, how much lithium can we get out? We know we can get it all out if we go to a high enough voltage, but this electrolyte is not stable there. We also know there's quite a lot of data now by my colleague Jeff Don, who's speaking next, that there's large volume changes, and that these volume changes probably cause the cracking of these meatballs. So you can see here, this is his data from a couple of years ago. And it doesn't matter whether you substitute these materials or not. If the pure nickel compound, you get a two-phase reaction here. By substituting it, phase for the volume. Point out this is not a huge volume change. This is less than the volume change we see in TiS2 or in graphite itself. But this small volume change, when you pack these particles together, when they're crammed together, will cause the meatballs to crack. And Jan Cook's son has come up with the same idea. As soon as you get above about 60%, that's the same point here, then your capacity retention falls off the cliff. So the question we ask, and I'll let Jeff answer it in a moment, is 210 a real limit, or can we go larger? And does single crystals really help? And I'll just show you a few single crystals. So we go back 40 odd years. Here's TiS2 where we use single crystals. Okay, these were huge single crystals, now hundreds of microns across. If you go back to Sony's original work, it's by Nishi and others, they use single crystal particles exceeding 20 microns. This particular picture is one of Jeff's, and his are about 5 microns, but they use large particles for safety reasons. Here is today's meatballs, 60%, and here is, I think, Jeff's material with 50% and his single crystals. Okay. And I think he's going to be talking about that in a moment, so I won't go into it. But there are two reasons for using single crystals. The same one Sony had, less surface area, less side reactions. No cracking of the secondary particles, which should give much longer life. And as Jay Xiao showed when she looked at single crystals of 76% nickel, and these are her single crystals published in Science last year, she said if you keep them at about 3 microns or less, the single crystals do not crack. So there is again a clear message. Let me go on to a very short little piece on the second part. Is really phosphates deserve a second look. As we heard in the previous talk, there's still interest in lithium iron phosphate, in lithium manganese phosphate, and there's clearly companies working on both of these. So this is a step forward from lithium iron phosphate. LG is working on this. I understand Saft is working on it, and the Gigafactory being built in Endicott, about 4 miles from my house, is also going to be manufacturing these materials. So this is one step above lithium iron phosphate. It's probably not quite as good, but it's got a better energy density. But really, if we want to get the phosphates higher, we need to put 2 electrons in there. There's been a number of attempts to make multi-electron cathodes. And I'll show you 3 examples on the right-hand side here. The first one was work we did at Exxon a long time ago. Vanadium diselenide cycles 2 lithiums very readily at 2 volts and about 1.3 volts. Too low to be of any interest, but they showed the feasibility in this large lattice. Mike Thackeray showed the nickel manganese oxide with a bit of titanium in it would intercalate 2 lithiums, but again, you can see the second lithiums at a very low voltage, and so not of too much interest. In 2005, we showed that we could put 2 lithiums into this vanadium phosphate phase, one at just under 4 volts and the other one at 2.5 volts. And so this is the material I'm going to be talking about right now. The advantage of the phosphates: no nickel, no cobalt, and minimal release of oxygen, though the manganese phosphate can do that. On the mobile ions, we have 2 options, lithium or sodium, or we can use a divalent cation such as magnesium, calcium, or zinc. I should point out, I'm not going to discuss it, folks have looked at magnesium in these vanadium phosphate. Magnesium does not intercalate, it abstracts an oxygen and makes magnesium oxide, and our colleagues studies. The cations we could look at is vanadium, nickel, manganese, and iron. Iron and is at too high a voltage for electrolytes. We know these two have not worked so far, so all our emphasis has been on this material. I wouldn't be talking about this unless it did work. And this is two of our students in our Energy Frontier Research Center. One of my students and one of Claire Gray's students picking up the prize from a Undersecretary of Energy of Department of Energy for one of the highlights from 2018. So let's look at this material for a moment. It's a tunnel structure, so a very stable structure. It's not going to change structures readily as you put lithiums in and out. We hope to put 2 lithiums in there. After many years of struggles, we found a way of making this, so it's electrochemically active. You just dissolve all the reactants in a solution, heat it up for about 180 degrees for 1 to 3 days. We'll then get this structure with protons in it. And the reason we don't use pure ethanol is you need a bit of water to stop over-reduction of vanadium. If you heat this up, then you get all the protons out and get this empty lattice. What I want to remind people is we want to do physical and chemical measurements on these materials. And the technique we developed at Exxon was using some chemical lithiation. We also had some chemical delithiation. The advantage of these techniques, you get very clean materials, no carbon black, no binder mixed in with them. And the byproducts of this reaction is typically octane, butene, or butane, which you can get rid of easily. So it's very easy to do conductivity measurements, do single crystal or other crystallographic measurements on this. And this chemical study was very promising because putting 2 lithiums in this lattice, we only saw an 8.5% volume increase. So this is less than the volume increase of, say, graphite. So using this technique, we made these cuboid particles, about 100 to 200 nanometers in size. We then mixed these with graphene. We found graphene was much more effective than carbon black. It has a much higher aspect ratio. And you can see here's the cycling curves, 50 of them, they all fall directly on top of each other, which shows that the material is very stable. It can sustain 2 lithiums going in and out. And if you look at this, you can see that the first cycle, the black one, and the 50th cycle, the purple one, is in fact slightly better on the 50th cycle. So clearly very stable. So we've got proof of concept that we can intercalate 2 ions into a crystalline lattice. It does not mean we're home and dry. We've still got lots of research to do. There are some issues here. The kinetics are quite different for the 2 redox plateaus. So in the high voltage region, we have a 2-phase reaction, vanadium phosphate and lithium vanadium phosphate. So we've got a flat discharge here. This is kinetically limited, and we're studying now how to change that. And you can see here's a C/50. If we go to C rate, we've lost over 50% of the capacity. So this is not a high rate material. We believe we should be able to substitute this material just like the olivine lithium iron phosphate. Pure lithium iron phosphate is not all that good. A little bit of substitution in there and nanosizing makes it extremely high rate. And we do that, basically changes the phase diagram. Let's now look at the low voltage region. So we first put in our 2 lithiums down here, then we cycle it in this region. And now you can see whether we're at C/50 or C rate, the capacity is exactly the same as 150, which is the theoretical amount. The difference in these curves is just the IR loss and diffusion, the diffusion limitation we suspect. And you can see here's the lithium intercalation, essentially flat for all rates. You'll notice here, though, we have an issue. On charging, we get putting more capacity in than we get out. We're getting the theoretical amount out, so we're not damaging the lattice in any way. But this material is oxidizing the solvent. So we have to find new solvents that are not oxidized by the vanadium phosphate. And this should not be a total surprise because these vanadium phosphates are used as oxidation catalysts in the petroleum industry. This is a particularly interesting material because it exists in at least 7 different phases, and I expect we could make more of them. Each one of these has a different lattice size, so we can choose the phase we want to match the diffusion path to the ion size. So we have a layered structure here. You can see this about 88 cube angstroms per phosphate. A beta phase about 84. The phase we're looking at now is 85 and a bit. These two are equally good for lithium. There doesn't seem to be too much difference. And there's this potassium phase, which is much larger. And we found this phase will readily intercalate sodium in and out. Sodium does not easily go into these lattices. It's too large for the tunnel size. But this one will go into it. If we take the potassium out, we can then put sodium into the lattice. So this is our epsilon phase. This is the potassium phase. And here is our material. We charge it up first, take out most of the potassium, okay? Then we can discharge it reversibly, but what we're left with is about 1/3 potassium in that lattice. We're still trying to get that last potassium out, but the sodium will go in and out. The voltage changes a bit too much, more than we would like. And folks in Japan, Kamaba's group, I think, have studied potassium intercalates in and out of this structure as well. So this is a very interesting structure. We're hoping that we can, in fact, enhance it so we can make these two materials react reversibly and be used and have a higher energy density than the simple lithium iron phosphate or lithium manganese phosphate. And we published this work about 3 years ago. So let me finish by making a few comments. It's my belief that lithium intercalation systems will dominate for the next 5 to 10 years. We heard in the last talk possibilities for lithium sulfur, and Battery 500 project is also looking at sulfur. But that's probably at least 5 years away, even for smallest systems. Amongst the cathodes, the NMCA is probably going to be dominant, but cobalt has to go. I think it must go essentially to 0 if we can do it. And I think Jeff Don has shown he doesn't believe cobalt is essential. I believe the phosphates are critical as we move forward. It's a means of getting rid of the cobalt and the nickel, and there's no rational reason in my mind why we're not using the olivines, these materials, more for grid energy storage rather than using the more expensive NMCs. And obviously these are less safe than these materials would be. And initially, grid storage, certainly in the US, we had a facility in Binghamton, used lithium iron phosphate. As I say, the next step is lithium manganese phosphate, and I expect some of these vanadium phosphates and others will take place in the market as well. People grumble, there's not enough vanadium in the world. Well, there's lots more vanadium in the world than there is nickel, cobalt, copper, and a lot of other transition metals. It is the 4th most abundant transition metals. A key aspect, we need safe and stable electrolytes, and that's, I would say, is really a limiting step to pushing the energy density still higher. We got to make the electrolyte safer. And the question there is, can solid state give us the required power densities? It's clear that all solid state batteries with using inorganic electrolytes is still some time off. And the question will be, how much pressure do you have to use in those systems to solve the interfacial issues? I should point out that there are solid state batteries that have been around for some years. People tend to forget it. It's commercial using a lithium metal, PEO electrolyte, and lithium iron phosphate at 70 degrees centigrade. This is Blue Solutions in France. It's used with cars, which are shared cars, so they run as a fleet, so professionals are looking after them. Mercedes is putting these Blue Solutions batteries in their buses, and they will be available, I gather, later this year. They have enough energy density that buses will not need to be recharged during the day, just at night, whereas the regular buses have to be recharged halfway through the day. So we also see excellent progress for liquid electrolytes. I think lithium metal is viable. We have some convincing of folks to do there. We clearly need new manufacturing technologies. We've got to reduce the 60 to 80 kilowatt hours needed to produce today 1 kilowatt of lithium-ion batteries. We need regional supply chains, just like Europe is building one. I think North America is building one. Asia already has those. We need them so the components don't get shipped around the world 2 or 3 times. And we need clean recycling technologies, give us a sustainable society. For example, we're going to have to get rid of eventually of NMP for coating electrodes. It looks like Europe is going to ban it. It's going to happen elsewhere. So we also need, I think, in here, one-step processes using cheaper materials to actually make the cathodes. And I will stop there and try to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Professor Whittingham. It's always a pleasure to listen to your lecture. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. We do have a couple questions for you. Speaking of the positive future of the phosphate, now that lithium iron phosphate is tapping into the EV market, can you make some comments about how can the potential of the phosphates be brought up, because they do have a smaller capacity and also the voltage step in your vanadium oxide phosphate-based materials. Could you make some comments about how we overcome those shortcomings?
Yeah, first, I think for grid storage, lithium iron phosphate is fine today. If we want to increase it, then we obviously go to the manganese analog. And my colleagues told me they can get just as good high rate performance out of the manganese compound. That gets us from 3.5 to 4 volts. It doesn't get us to the same energy density as the NMCs. We worried about the vanadium phosphates, but if you look at the lithium manganese rich layered oxides, or some of the other disordered oxides, they show just as much voltage change. It may be in a more linear fashion. But the electrical engineers told me, stop worrying about the voltage change. It's all DC conversion. It's going to cost a little bit more money, but we can handle that. I think what we need to look at is how stable these materials are over 1,000 or 10,000 cycles. If you're going on the grid, you're talking thousands of cycles. For electric vehicles, you're probably not doing more than the equivalent of 500 to 1,000 cycles. But clearly, even Tesla is now saying for their smaller, lower cost cars, they're going to go to lithium iron phosphate. And the cars they're manufacturing in China and shipping to Germany are all using lithium iron phosphate. So I think we're going to see lithium iron phosphate coming back now that I think the Chinese have stopped subsidizing to such an extent the NMC compounds.
Thank you, Stan. So the second question, just very quickly, because your comments are very inspiring, that even though the Nobel Prize is given, the young folks have to keep pushing for the R&D. So if you have one or two advice to given to the young folks that come into this field, what advice will you give to them?
Do something different. I would say don't work on NMC, the young folks. No,
Thank you.
That's for the old timers to try to incrementally improve it. Need new compounds with no cobalt in it, ideally with no lithium. I think lithium sulfur is still a great opportunity. We need some really smart ideas to make that work.
Mhm.
And no, don't be afraid. Risks is my other comment. You're going to make some errors, but you won't make breakthroughs unless you take risks.
Thank you, Stan. Please remember your remark. You know, knowledge is limited, but imagination is limitless. So we should always try to do different things and take risks. Yeah. Thank you, Stan. Once again, you know, please join me to thank Professor Whittingham for this wonderful presentation.